It started with silence. Not the comfortable kind that comes when people understand each other too well to speak, but the cold, calculated kind. The kind that creeps in when you've been quietly erased from a tradition you thought was unshakable. Every December, since I could remember, my family hosted Christmas together. Grand lights tangled across the porch. The smell of cinnamon rolls at 7 a.m. sharp. Matching pajamas. The usual chaos of dogs barking, kids tearing through wrapping paper, and endless noise that somehow felt like home. But this year, nothing. No invite. No group texts, just absence. I stared at my phone, refreshing it, checking again for any overlooked message. Maybe it went to spam. Maybe they created a new thread and forgot to include me. Maybe, just maybe, it was an oversight. It wasn't 2 days before Christmas. While I stood alone in my apartment sipping cold coffee, I saw the photos go up. Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. Every feed flooded with warm faces I knew too well, my parents, my sister Chelsea, her fiancé Brad, even distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. All smiling. All cozy. All very much together, except me. No caption mentioned my name. No empty seat at the table. No acknowledgement that I ever belonged there. The ache in my chest wasn't just sadness. It was clarity. This wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Still, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Foolish, I know. But I called my mother anyway, because despite everything, I wanted to believe there was an explanation. Some wild miscommunication. A last-minute plan I missed. Anything. She didn't answer, and neither did Chelsea, not even a text back. So, I waited until December 26. That's when I received an envelope in the mail, not from a lawyer, not even with a note, just an official-looking packet sent from my parents' address. Inside, a $52,000 invoice. In my name, for Chelsea's brand new Mercedes. The air left my lungs like I'd been punched. I flipped through the papers, hands trembling, heart racing. It wasn't just a bill, it was a full loan application. Signed with my forged signature. Approved. Active. Monthly installments already scheduled to withdraw from my account, and just like that, everything made sense. They hadn't just excluded me from Christmas, they had set the stage, isolated me, then struck when they assumed I'd be too heartbroken, or too slow, to fight back. Chelsea had always been the golden one. The baby. The one with the dreams and the potential. I was the steady daughter. Reliable. The one who always had savings, who never missed a payment, who never asked for help. They knew exactly what they were doing. I dialed my father straight to voicemail, again. On the third try, he picked up. Amber, he said flatly, like my name tasted bitter in his mouth. I got the invoice, I said. No anger. Just facts. You can afford it, he replied, without hesitation. She needed help. You've always been the responsible one. As if that justified it. If stealing from me, because that's what this was an act of practicality. Not betrayal. I didn't sign anything, I said slowly, fighting to steady my voice. This is fraud. There was a pause, then, laughter, not loud, not amused, dry. I see, you really want to drag your family into court over a car? And in that moment, I understood exactly how little they valued me, not just my bank account. Me, the person, the daughter, the sister. A human being they could discard like used wrapping paper once my usefulness ran out. I hung up. No goodbye. No explanation, just a click, and a promise forming in my chest like a storm cloud. They wanted me erased, now I would make them remember. The world didn't shift overnight. But something inside me did. That evening, I sat in silence, surrounded by neatly organized evidence of betrayal. The invoice was still on the table, papers slightly curled at the edges, glaring up at me like a dare. I stared at it as if it would offer answers, some explanation, some flicker of remorse hidden between the lines. There was none, just cold figures and forged promises I never made. I could have screamed. Could have thrown something. But I didn't. Instead, I did what I always did. I thought, strategically. Carefully. If they believed I'd roll over, they hadn't paid attention to the version of me they helped build. The woman who budgeted meticulously. Who reviewed every contract before signing, who never gave anyone the keys to her future. They confused kindness with weakness. Dependability with permission. They were about to learn the difference. First, I printed every document. Triple copies. One for me. One for the authorities. One for the bank. I took photographs, timestamped them, stored everything on both a flash drive and a password-protected cloud folder. If this spiraled into a courtroom, I'd be prepared. They didn't just forge a signature, they manipulated credit reports, impersonated me on phone calls, provided fake pay stubs in my name. There was effort behind this deception, layers of coordination that required thought, calculation, and malice. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a conspiracy, and it ran deeper than I'd imagined. I checked my accounts next. Not just the one tied to the car payments, every single financial portal I had. credit cards, student loan portals, health insurance, retirement plans. I wanted to know if anything else had been tampered with. To my horror, I discovered 2 unauthorized logins from a device I didn't recognize. Both occurred late at night, once in November, once 2 days before Christmas. I remembered now, that one call from my mother just before Thanksgiving. She had said her printer wasn't working and needed to email me a document to look over for a friend's business. Naively, I had opened the attachment. It hadn't been blank. It had been a phishing link. They didn't just betray me emotionally, they had digitally broken into my life and taken what they wanted like it belonged to them. I sat back in my chair, fingers frozen over my laptop keyboard, a rage so quiet it nearly frightened me. This wasn't anger that exploded. This was the kind that simmered, slow, hot, focused, and it demanded resolution. I wasn't going to respond with chaos. That would give them exactly what they expected, a messy emotional reaction they could weaponize later. Call me dramatic. Unstable. Say I was overreacting. No, I would respond with precision. That night, I drafted a full report to my financial institution. Included screenshots, login timestamps, copies of the forged documents, and a notarized affidavit of fraud. By morning, my case had been assigned to an internal investigator. They froze the account, halted all withdrawals, flagged the car loan. For identity misuse, the relief wasn't instant, but it was enough to help me breathe. Then, I contacted a lawyer, not just any lawyer, an expert in identity theft and family-based fraud. Her name was Asha Patel, and from the moment she picked up the phone, I knew I wasn't alone anymore. She didn't gasp. She didn't pity me, she listened, methodically, quietly. When I finished, she asked one question: how far are you willing to take this? I paused, because that was the real question, wasn't it? How far was I willing to go to protect my name, my future, my dignity? All the way, I said without hesitation. Her voice didn't flinch. Then let's begin. We met that afternoon in a quiet corner office in Midtown. Glass walls, hushed tones, leather-bound folders stacked with previous battles fought and won. Asha had me walk her through the timeline, then outlined our next moves like a general plotting a counterstrike. First, a cease and desist letter addressed to my family, formally stating they were under legal scrutiny, and any further tampering would result in criminal charges. Second, full documentation submitted to the credit bureaus, alerting them of identity theft. Third, a personal statement drafted for law enforcement, triggering a potential investigation into wire fraud. This wasn't about revenge, this was about reclaiming my autonomy. They had thrown me out of Christmas like discarded tinsel, assuming my silence equaled surrender. Instead, I was building something much more powerful than retaliation. I was building a firewall, not just around my finances, but around my heart, and nothing they did would ever break through again. That night, I sat on my balcony, the winter air sharp against my skin. I watched the lights of the city flicker, people below rushing through lives untouched by my crisis. It hit me then: I had spent years cushioning everyone else's comfort, paying for mistakes that weren't mine, staying silent to keep the peace, making myself small so others could shine brighter. Not anymore. They forged my name, but they didn't own my story. That power still belonged to me. 3 days later, the cease and desist letter arrived at my parents' home via certified mail. I didn't tell them it was coming. No warning. No explanation. Just a formal document from a real law firm printed on official stationery, stamped, and sealed, with their names on the envelope. It landed in their mailbox like a bomb. By 10 a.m., my phone lit up with Chelsea's number. I didn't answer. 30 minutes later, she sent a message: what is this? Are you serious right now? I read it and put the phone face down. At 11:13, my mother called, then again. By noon, I'd received 7 missed calls, a string of texts ranging from denial to outrage to sudden pleas for a private conversation. Suddenly, I was important again. Not the invisible daughter. Not the one worth excluding from Christmas. Now I was a threat to their illusion of control. Funny how quickly priorities change when legal action enters the picture. Asha had been right to send the document without delay. It detailed every offense: financial misrepresentation, forged documents, unauthorized use of personally identifiable information. It also outlined potential consequences: civil damages, criminal liability, and long-term credit ramifications. What unnerved them most, I think, was the tone. It was factual. It was cold. It left no room for negotiation. That same day, Asha filed a fraud report with local law enforcement. Not because we expected immediate arrests, but because documentation was power. Every step we took added bricks to a wall they couldn't climb. No amount of gaslighting or guilt-tripping could unwrite what had already been submitted. Meanwhile, my bank confirmed reversal of the first auto payment. The fraudulent loan had been suspended pending investigation. My credit report was being reviewed line by a specialist assigned to my case. I wasn't just protected, I was finally being seen. Still, my parents weren't done. That evening, I got an email from my father.no subject line, just, "We raised you. We trusted you. And now you're dragging this family through the mud over something that could have been resolved privately. Shame on you." Shame, they had manipulated my credit, forged my name, stolen from me in silence, and I was supposed to carry the shame. That was the old script, the one I had burned out. I didn't respond, but I read every word, not because it hurt, because it confirmed everything. They weren't sorry, they were just mad they'd been caught. The next morning, I met Asha for coffee. We sat across from each other in a small shop downtown, the kind with brick walls and steaming mugs and quiet corners where strategy could unfold uninterrupted. "They're going to fight back," she said simply, tapping her pen against the edge of her notebook. "Expect pushback. Probably character attacks. They'll say you've always been unstable, ungrateful, difficult." "They've said all that before," I replied, calmly stirring cream into my drink. "This time, I have receipts." She nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing her face. "Good. We plan next steps. A formal affidavit to support future prosecution, additional notices to all 3 major credit bureaus, placing a long-term fraud alert on my identity, monitoring software to detect future intrusion attempts. Even if they never admitted guilt, they'd never be able to do this again." Later that week, I called the dealership where Chelsea's car had been purchased. I requested to speak with their finance department, citing the open investigation and referencing the claim number tied to the fraudulent purchase. At first, the woman on the other end was defensive, understandably. But once I sent over the notarized statement, timestamps, and legal documentation, her tone shifted. "Ma'am," she said gently, this isn't just unusual. This is serious. We'll cooperate fully." I thanked her, hung up, sat quietly, because in that moment, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about breaking the cycle. My whole life, I had been the fixer. The quiet one. The one who kept things together while everyone else spun out. But this time, I was dismantling the machine that enabled their behavior. Slowly. Methodically. Without ever raising my voice. I wasn't the storm. I was the consequence. That weekend, I got a message from Brad, Chelsea's fiancé. I had no idea about the loan. "I'm sorry. She told me you offered to co-sign." If I had known, I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say, because offered wasn't forged, and co-sign wasn't stolen identity. Let them panic, let them run in circles. I wasn't chasing apologies anymore. I was reclaiming my space. My life. My future, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the outsider in my own story. The knock came late Sunday evening. 3 soft taps, measured, deliberate. I knew before I opened the door. It was her. Chelsea stood on the threshold in a long beige coat, her expression somewhere between defiance and desperation. In one hand, she clutched her phone. In the other, a keychain with a Mercedes logo swinging like a pendulum between us. She hadn't called. Hadn't texted. Hadn't warned me she was coming. Typical. "What do you want?" I asked, unmoved. She hesitated. The moment hung between us. Like a frozen breath. "I figured we should talk," she finally said. "Face to face." I stepped aside without a word and motioned her in. No hugs. No small talk. No warmth. Just a hallway soaked in tension and a sister trying to rewrite history before it caught up with her. We sat across from each other at my kitchen table, where bills used to be sorted, where birthdays had once been planned, where promises had been broken without hesitation. Chelsea shifted in her seat, eyes scanning the room like she was searching for sympathy. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she began, voice low. "It was supposed to be temporary." I blinked. "Temporary?" I repeated, incredulous. "You forged my identity and took out a $52,000 loan. That's not borrowing a sweater, Chelsea. That's a felony." She flinched but recovered quickly, trying to smooth her hair like composure would disguise her guilt. "I just thought you wouldn't notice. You have so much saved. I figured I'd pay it back before it became an issue." There it was, the entitlement, the casual belief that my sacrifices were community property. That my planning, my restraint, my sleepless nights, building a future for myself could be quietly rerouted to fuel her whims. She didn't just steal from me, she had convinced herself I owed it to her. "And the Christmas photos?" I asked, leaning back. "No invite. No explanation. Just staged perfection without me." Her face reddened. "That wasn't about you. It was exactly about me." She looked down, silent, because deep down, she knew I was right. This wasn't a slip. Up. It was a pattern. Years of being the favored daughter had taught her one thing: there would always be a safety net. Always someone to clean up her messes. Always me. "I didn't expect you to lawyer up," she admitted, almost like a compliment. "You've never been confrontational. You never left me a choice," I replied. She opened her mouth again, then shut it. Her confidence faltered, and for the first time, I saw her for who she really was, not the charming younger sister who got away with everything, but someone trapped inside her own bad decisions, hoping the consequences would delay themselves indefinitely. I stood. I need you to leave. She looked stunned. That's it? That's it. She rose slowly, shoulders slumped under the weight of a reality she couldn't spin. As she walked to the door, I added one final thing: you didn't break me. She turned, lips parted, but the words died before they could form. I shut the door behind her. No locks clicked. No curtains were drawn. I just stood there, calm, steady, complete. The meeting wasn't closure. It was confirmation that she hadn't come to apologize, she had come to manage the damage, and when she realized I wasn't going to undo the mess for her this time, she left just like they all did, without responsibility, without remorse. But I wasn't the same person anymore. The one who used to bend to keep the peace had disappeared. In her place stood someone entirely different, someone who understood boundaries, someone who knew the difference between love and obligation, and most importantly, someone who was no longer available for abuse disguised as family. On Monday morning, as the frost lingered on the windowpanes and the city stirred with its usual chaos, I walked into the police department, not as a victim begging for help, but as a woman ready to reclaim what had been taken. The air inside the precinct was dry, antiseptic, humming faintly with the quiet rhythm of keyboards tapping and radios squawking in distant corners. I sat across from a detective named Rosario, a stocky woman with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't waste syllables. She didn't smile when she shook my hand, didn't offer false comfort. She simply said, "Tell me everything." And so I did. Every detail. Every forged document. The fake pay stubs. The phishing email. The exact dates of unauthorized access. The notarized affidavit. The freeze notices. The cease and desist letter. I laid it all out like a surgeon presenting x-rays before an operation, clinical, precise, undeniable. Detective Rosario didn't interrupt me. She only nodded occasionally and took notes, her pen gliding across the page in steady strokes. When I finished, she flipped through the file once, then looked up. "Do you want to press charges?" The question hung in the air, stark and heavy, as though it demanded a piece of my soul to answer. I didn't reply right away. Not because I was unsure, but because the weight of it needed to be felt. I stared at her, unblinking. "Yes," I said. "Finally. I want this on record. I want it to follow them. I want there to be consequences." There was no drama in my tone, no fury in my face. Just clarity. She nodded, stapled the first part of the file together, and handed me a receipt for the report. "We'll be in touch," she said. "If anything changes, contact me directly." When I stepped back onto the sidewalk, I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolute. There's a difference between winning and standing up. What I had done wasn't about vengeance, it was about refusing to let their actions slide into the shadowy pile of family matters swept under the rug for the sake of appearances. They counted on that silence. They weaponized it. And now, that silence had been shattered by formal documentation. Legal attention. A case number. A trail they couldn't erase. That afternoon, Asha called to update me. The bank had completed their initial fraud investigation and confirmed multiple discrepancies, IP address mismatches, voice verification anomalies, and email inconsistencies that pointed clearly to manipulation. "They're flagging the account for full revocation," Asha explained. "Which means the dealership is likely to demand return of the vehicle." That single sentence rewired something in my chest. For weeks, they had flaunted that car like a trophy. I had seen it in Chelsea's Instagram stories, gliding down city streets with her captioned, "Earned it nail polish." No. She hadn't earned anything. She had stolen it and cloaked it in glitter. That glitter was about to be stripped away. A few hours later, Chelsea texted again. This time, her words were less performative. Less outraged. More erratic. "They're saying they're going to take it back," the message read. "What do I do?" I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Let her sit with that feeling. The same confusion I had felt when the invoice first arrived. The same helplessness. The same disbelief. My mother tried calling again that evening. I let it ring. Then, without checking the voicemail, I blocked her number. It was an act of mercy, not cruelty. Because if I had listened to whatever justification she had rehearsed, I might have yelled, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of watching me break. I wanted peace, not with them, but within myself. I wanted a life where I didn't have to keep building armor just to survive holiday dinners. I wanted to stop playing defense in a war I never started. The news reached my father through someone, I don't know who. But I do know that the next day, my cousin Jenna messaged me, completely out of the blue. "Just heard what happened," she wrote. "If you ever want to talk. I've been through something similar. It's brave what you're doing." It stopped me cold. I had assumed this story was mine alone, my burden, my fallout, my scars. But apparently, others in the family had suffered similar fates. Silenced. Dismissed. Made to feel like the cost of love was quiet sacrifice. And for what? Appearances? Tradition? Illusions? That evening, as I looked over the folder Asha had assembled, now thick with timelines, emails, screenshots, transcripts, I realized this case was no longer just a shield. It was a torch. And I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was blazing a path through generations of entitlement and manipulation. My name wasn't a convenience. My savings weren't a communal bank. My loyalty wasn't permission. My existence wasn't conditional, and as the days stretched on, and the paper trail wound tighter around their lies, I began to see the one thing they never expected, me, unflinching, unmoved, and utterly unwilling to return to the version of myself they thought they could control. They may have signed my name without asking. But the signature that mattered now? The one at the bottom of that police report? That was all mine. The call came late Wednesday morning, not from a family member, but from the dealership. The manager, a man named Calvin, had a clipped tone, somewhere between professional courtesy and tightly reined frustration. He informed me the vehicle in question had been flagged for repossession. According to the financing records, I was still listed as the guarantor. Due to the formal fraud report, he said, we're initiating action to reclaim the asset unless full payment is made in 72 hours. I asked if Chelsea had been notified. Yes, he confirmed. She was less than cooperative. I almost laughed. Of course she was. She'd built her adult life on expectations that someone else would absorb the fallout. But this was an emotional mess. This was paperwork, liability, jurisdiction. There was no apology emoji for legal breach. By the afternoon, my inbox filled with frantic attempts to reach me, Chelsea from her personal address, my mother from a new number, even my father through an old email account I hadn't seen active since high school. They all shared one theme: panic. The car was being taken. Investigators were asking questions. The mask was slipping. No more scripted family dinners, no more polished group photos, no more pretending everything was harmonious. While draining me from behind the curtain, I didn't respond to any of it. Not because I didn't have words, but because I no longer had energy for circular dialogues where truth was treated like an inconvenience. Instead, I scheduled another meeting with Asha. We sat across from each other again in her office, a quiet space filled with legal texts and thick files labeled with other people's stories, stories like mine, stories filled with hurt and reclamation. She opened our folder and pointed to a new document. The dealership has agreed to fully remove your name from the loan once the repossession is complete. They've also filed their own complaint regarding falsified signatures. That meant we now had two institutional entities backing our claims, my bank and the car supplier. This just turned criminal, Asha added. We're not in small claims territory anymore. Hearing that didn't fill me with satisfaction. It filled me with stillness. Because justice, as gratifying as it can be in theory, comes at a cost. The fallout wasn't just financial now, it was reputational, social, emotional. A fracture that would never heal in silence. And yet, I felt no regret. They had every opportunity to come clean, to apologize before escalation. But they chose gaslighting. They chose accusation. They chose arrogance. Later that evening, a photo appeared in one of Chelsea's stories. Her standing beside the Mercedes, face puffy from tears, captioned, "When even your own blood turns against you, broken heart." I didn't flinch. It was predictable. Frame herself as the victim. Paint me as the traitor. As if holding someone accountable equates to cruelty. The comments rolled in, sympathy from distant friends who didn't know the truth, heart emojis. From extended relatives who had likely only heard one version of events. Let them see what she wanted them to see. Because soon, they'd be forced to look closer. The next morning, the vehicle was gone. A flatbed arrived at 7:12 a.m. Secured it in quiet efficiency, and disappeared before most of the neighborhood even noticed. Chelsea didn't post anything that day. Neither did my mother. The silence was louder than any apology they never offered. That weekend, my cousin Jenna invited me for coffee. She had never taken sides openly but had always sensed the imbalance. When we sat down at a small cafe on the edge of town, she said something that stayed with me long after our mugs were empty. "You didn't burn the bridge," she said. "You just refused to keep rebuilding it while they lit matches." Those words hung in the air like gospel, because that's exactly what I'd done. I hadn't torched the relationship. I had stopped patching the cracks with my sanity. I had stopped justifying betrayal in the name of loyalty. I had stopped confusing endurance with love. They wanted to believe they could push me aside and still benefit from my resources. Still wear me like armor while discarding me at their convenience. But they were wrong. My silence wasn't forgiveness. It was fatigue. And once I found my voice again, the reckoning was inevitable. That night, as I filed away the latest confirmation, official detachment from the fraudulent loan, I lit a candle, not for meditation or mood, but as a quiet ritual. A closing ceremony. For a chapter built on misplaced trust. I sat with the flicker for hours, letting it melt the remains of old wounds. I had spent too long fighting for space in rooms that treated my presence as optional. But not anymore. They had underestimated the power of truth. Of proof. Of someone finally saying, enough, and now, they would learn that consequences don't always arrive in rage. Sometimes, they come in the form of legal letters. Of revoked privileges. Of assets reclaimed. Of silence that doesn't invite conversation, but ends it. By the start of the following week, I made a decision that had been quietly forming in the background of every voicemail, every legal email, every sleepless night. I terminated all remaining financial connections with my parents. Every joint account where my name lingered as an emergency contact, every insurance policy where I'd been listed without consent, every digital trace tying my records to theirs, I severed it. Cleanly. Quietly. Without warning. I walked into the bank I'd been using since college and sat down across from a woman named Karina, who handled estate transfers. She glanced at my identification, then met my eyes with a raised brow. "You're absolutely sure?" she asked. Fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't hesitate. "I'm done," I said, simple as that. No more shared lines. No more fallback obligations. No more ghost ties to people who saw me as a convenience, not a person. Once the process began, it moved quickly. The clerk removed my authorization on my father's investment profile. The insurance rep issued confirmation of removal from their health coverage. I even called the phone carrier to ensure no residual accounts were still shadowing my credit. It was a purge, not of rage, but of rot. I wasn't walking away in bitterness. I was cleaning the residue of a life I'd outgrown, one transaction at a time. And with each system that updated their records, I felt lighter, clearer, freer. Later that afternoon, I mailed back the last holiday card they'd ever sent me, one that had arrived 2 days before Christmas, signed, "From all of us." There had been no handwritten note. No mention of the betrayal already in progress. Just a printed message and a family photo with me edited out. I slipped the envelope into the outgoing bin, not with malice, but finality. Return to sender. The next day, Chelsea tried again. This time, it was a voice message. "Amber, please." She began, voice cracking. "They're saying I might be charged. Can't you just undo it? I didn't mean for this to spiral like it did. I swear. I thought it would be okay. That you wouldn't find out. That you wouldn't care." I was desperate. I needed help. "You were always the one who had it together. I'm sorry. Please. Just help me." I listened to the entire thing once, then deleted it, because what she wanted wasn't forgiveness, it was erasure. Not of guilt, but of consequences. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry I had taken back the power she assumed I'd never claim. That I had drawn a line, fortified it, and refused to let her step over it again. And that, more than any courtroom verdict, was the punishment they never saw coming. The absence of my cooperation. The end of my availability. The withdrawal of access to a resource they had drained without gratitude for years. That night, I finally updated my will. Asha recommended a solid estate planner, a soft-spoken man who reviewed my paperwork with meticulous care. When we got to the section on beneficiaries, I didn't hesitate. I listed a scholarship fund I'd quietly established at my alma mater, a small program supporting students from unstable households who, like me, needed someone to believe in their future. I left nothing to my family. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to enable patterns I had fought so hard to escape. My legacy wasn't theirs to consume. It was mine to shape. On the way home, I took a detour through the old neighborhood. The house I had grown up in sat exactly as I remembered: white shutters, cracked driveway, porch swing that squeaked if the wind hit it right. But something felt different now. The weight it once carried, the invisible leash that yanked every time I tried to walk away, it was gone. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I just passed by like it was any other street, like I was just another driver on a road I no longer called home. That weekend, I booked a trip, nothing extravagant, just a quiet cabin in Vermont, surrounded by snow and silence and no signal towers. I packed light, no laptop, no legal documents, no reminders of anything but breath and space. For 3 days, I didn't speak to anyone. I watched the fireplace crackle, drank tea without checking my phone, and sat in stillness long enough to remember what peace felt like without interruption. And somewhere between the frost-covered pines and the echo of complete solitude, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted, not even to myself, that I had survived them, not just their lies, or the fraud, Or the years of emotional excavation. I had survived being told I was selfish for setting boundaries. I had survived the erosion of trust disguised as tradition. I had survived the lie that love is proven by how much pain you're willing to absorb, and now, there was no forwarding address, not for guilt, not for blame, not for the people who only loved me when I stayed small. They had lost access, and I had gained myself. The envelope arrived 2 weeks later, wedged between a water bill and a marketing flyer from a nearby realtor. Plain white. No return address. My name handwritten in a careful, almost unfamiliar script. For a moment, I thought it was junk, another ploy, another half-hearted attempt to guilt me into contact. But something about the handwriting tugged at a distant memory, like the whisper of a voice I hadn't heard in years. I opened it without ceremony, expecting nothing. Inside was a single sheet, folded into thirds, the paper thick and slightly wrinkled, as though it had been carried around for a while before being mailed. It wasn't from Chelsea. Not directly. It was from my father, but not addressed to me. The note was a rough draft, undelivered, unsent, never intended for my eyes. A letter he had written to one of his old college friends, trying to explain the situation with me. The first sentence stopped me cold. She's always been the one who didn't bend. He didn't mean it as praise. He described me like a problem, difficult, distant, inflexible. Someone who held grudges. Someone who took everything personally. She just never learned how to let things go, he wrote, even when it was for the good of the family. He framed my refusal to pay for the car as dramatic. Claimed I'd been looking for a reason to cut them off. Painted Chelsea as immature, yes, but ultimately well-meaning. Said I was too proud to forgive. That I was letting a simple lone miscommunication destroy decades of family unity. By the end of the page, my hands trembled, not from rage, not from sorrow, but from confirmation. This is what they believed. That my boundaries were betrayal. That holding them accountable was selfish. That speaking the truth was an act of war. That my silence wasn't a scream of pain but a strategy to make them look bad. That I was never grieving, only grandstanding. I folded the letter slowly, carefully, and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even destroy it. I just placed it in a drawer marked records, filed behind the fraud documents, the credit report statements, and the police correspondence, because it wasn't shocking. It was consistent. It fit perfectly into the pattern of how they had rewritten history every time reality didn't serve their version of events, but seeing it in his words, on his terms, hit differently. He wasn't confused. He wasn't unaware. He was deliberate, and the mask he wore for years, of the quiet, neutral father who just wanted peace, finally cracked wide open. He had known. He had chosen sides. And the moment I stopped complying, I became an enemy of his comfort. That weekend, I did something uncharacteristic. I went live. No drama. No theatrics. Just me, in front of my camera, explaining what happened. I didn't name names. I didn't expose anyone directly. I just told my truth, about fraud, betrayal, emotional erasure, and the silent price of being the strong one in a family that only loves you when you're useful. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from strangers who saw themselves in every sentence. People who had been scapegoated, disbelieved, exiled for not playing along. Some were in tears. Others were simply relieved to know they weren't alone. It wasn't about going viral. It was about reclaiming the narrative. I refused to let them be the only ones telling the story anymore. They could spin whatever tales they needed to soothe their shame, but I had documentation. I had receipts, and now, I had witnesses. I received an email the next day, from a therapist in Boston who had seen the stream. She offered a consultation. Said she had worked with many individuals navigating family systems rooted in denial and control. I accepted. Not because I thought I was broken, but because healing in isolation was no longer enough. During the first session, she asked me one question: when did you first realize you were the adult in the family? I laughed, unexpectedly. Then paused, probably around 13, I said. When I figured out that peace was always my job, even when I didn't cause the chaos. She nodded slowly, and for the first time in months, I felt something unexpected: validation, not from approval, but from recognition. She didn't pity me, she saw me, and that, more than any apology I would never receive, was enough to remind me I wasn't crazy. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't unreasonable. I was just no longer complicit, and that decision had saved my life. Up until that point, I had kept everything compartmentalized. My coworkers knew I'd been distant. My closest friends noticed the deflections, the half-truths, the vanished plans and hollow smiles. But no one truly knew the scale of what had happened. I had carried it like a locked briefcase, heavy, silent, impenetrable. Outwardly composed. Inwardly unraveling. The fear wasn't judgment, it was vulnerability. I didn't want to watch their eyes change when I revealed how deeply I'd been used by people who shared my blood. I didn't want to answer questions I wasn't ready to explain. I didn't want to seem damaged, even though, privately, I knew I was healing, but eventually, holding it in became louder than letting it out. So I started with Sophia, my closest friend since grad school. We met at our usual coffee spot, her cheeks still red from the wind, scarf half loose around her neck. She gave me the usual warm smile, but I didn't return it. Not fully. I just said, I need to tell you something. And then, without dramatics, I unraveled the whole story. Every detail. Her mouth fell open somewhere around the forged documents. By the end, she was gripping her cup so tightly the sleeve had creased. When I finished, she didn't ask for clarification. Didn't demand proof, she simply whispered, "How did you survive that alone?" I didn't know how to answer. But her question pierced deeper than anything I'd been asked in months. It wasn't about legality. It was about endurance. Sophia reached over and took my hand. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it," she said. "I thought you were just busy. I didn't realize you were drowning." I exhaled, slow and shaky, because that's exactly what it had been, drowning in expectations, pressure, guilt, and shame, pretending the water wasn't rising, pretending I wasn't sinking. Next was my boss, Maya. Not because I owed her a personal explanation, but because she had always believed in transparency and had quietly supported me when I requested time off without explanation. I asked for a private meeting, and when we sat down in her glass-walled office, I told her the condensed version. Not every painful moment, but the core facts: family fraud, legal proceedings, identity theft, recovery process. She leaned back, listening intently. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." Then added, "I always knew you carried more than you let on. And I hope you know, you've handled it with more grace than most people ever could." It wasn't a performance review. It was acknowledgement, and that mattered more than any formal praise. Lastly, there was Ethan, the man I'd been dating on and off for nearly a year. We had kept things light: movies, dinners, shared playlists, inside jokes. But I had always held back. Not because I didn't care, but because something in me feared that if he saw the damage underneath, he'd walk away. But one evening, as we sat on the floor of my apartment eating takeout, he reached for my hand and said, "You've been somewhere else lately. I don't need details you're not ready to share, but I want you to know I see you. Even the parts you think you're hiding." That broke something in me, not in a painful way, but in a way that felt like the cracking of ice, making room for thaw. I set down my chopsticks, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm ready to tell you." So I did, start to finish. No edits. No sugarcoating. Just truth. When I was done, he didn't say anything immediately. He pulled me into a hug and held me tightly for a long time, as if anchoring me back into a world where safety wasn't just a concept, it was real. Afterward, he looked at me and said, "You're not broken. You're brave. And if they couldn't see your worth, that's on them, not you." That sentence echoed in my mind for days, because it was the opposite of everything I had internalized growing up. I had been told I was difficult, overreactive, ungrateful, but here was someone saying I was courageous, and he wasn't alone. Friend by friend, coworker by coworker. As I let the truth out, one story at a time, something remarkable happened. No one turned away. No one minimized it. No one asked what I had done to provoke it. Instead, they offered space, support, validation, and slowly, I realized that the lie I had been sold, that speaking about trauma would push people away, was just another tactic to keep me quiet. Silence protected the ones who hurt me, but honesty protected me, and now, I wasn't hiding anymore, not behind work, not behind forced smiles, not behind carefully managed conversations. I was here, open, whole, and finally, understood. By mid-March, everything was moving faster than I could track. What had started as a quiet withdrawal, disconnecting, re-establishing boundaries, protecting myself, had snowballed into something much larger. What none of them expected was that the system, slow though it often is, eventually responds to truth backed by evidence. And I had both. The investigators had concluded their work, the dealership had submitted their final report, and the bank had completed their internal review. That week, I received a formal notice: Chelsea was being charged with identity fraud and forgery. Reading the official document didn't bring triumph. There were no fist pumps. No feelings of superiority. Only a cold, undeniable stillness. The kind that settles in when a storm finally breaks and you're standing in the quiet wreckage, unsure whether to cry or breathe. The following day, I got a call from the detective handling the case. He informed me that Chelsea's legal team had requested a plea deal. They wanted to avoid jail time by offering restitution and mandated therapy. He asked if I'd be willing to accept that route instead of pushing for a full trial. "It would mean this ends faster," he said. "But the choice is yours." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked for a day to think. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the letter again, the one from my father to his old friend, the one not meant for my eyes. I reread every sentence, searching for even a trace of regret. There was none. Only justification. Only defense. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about Chelsea's mistake. It was about a culture they all nurtured, a home where wrongdoing was tolerated as long as it was kept quiet, where loyalty meant silence and consequences were seen as betrayal. Accepting the deal wouldn't be forgiveness. It would be surrender, but at the same time, dragging things through court would be another kind of wound, a public dissection of a life I was finally beginning to rebuild. I didn't need to see her punished. I needed to see myself free. The next morning, I made the call. I'll accept the plea, I told the detective. As long as the restitution includes full repayment and the record shows a formal admission of guilt. He paused, then said, that's a mature choice. I respect it. But this wasn't about maturity. It was about closure. 2 days later. The agreement was finalized. Chelsea would pay back every cent she owed, she would be required to attend accountability sessions, and she would carry a permanent mark on her record, a stain she could not rewrite. That weekend, I received a letter to this time. It was from Chelsea, typed 2 pages long. Apologetic. She claimed she didn't understand the damage at the time. Said she missed our bond. Repeated phrases like, family is complicated, and, I wish I had done things differently. I read every word. Not because I wanted reconciliation, but because it was important to see her finally speak without manipulation. I didn't reply. There are apologies that arrive too late to change anything, there are bridges that, once burned, should not be rebuilt, and there are survivors who reach a point where peace means walking away completely. A few days later, I met with Asha for what would be our final session. She handed me a folder, copies of every document, every correspondence, every form that had restored my independence. As we closed the file together, she looked at me and said, you should be proud. You stood your ground. I smiled, not because I felt powerful, but because I finally felt protected. Later that afternoon, I made a donation, not to a cause that made headlines, but to a small women's shelter on the outskirts of town, an anonymous gift labeled, for the ones who get blamed when they stop being quiet. It wasn't just money. It was a message. To every woman who's ever been told she's overreacting. To every daughter who's been gaslit for protecting herself. To every person who's been asked to suffer in silence so others can remain comfortable. You're not alone. You're not dramatic. You're just done, and that's not weakness. That's power. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd known. It wasn't tense. It wasn't charged with waiting or dread. It was clean, vast, and undisturbed, like a snowfield no one had walked across yet. For the first time in years, my phone no longer buzzed with demands disguised as check-ins. My inbox was clear of veiled obligations. My nights weren't spent bracing for the next financial ambush. I had expected that letting go would feel like grief. What I didn't anticipate was how much it would feel like rest. I started noticing little things. The mornings came without anxiety. No tightness in my chest. No dread in my throat. I'd wake up and make breakfast in a kitchen that was mine, truly mine, without lingering echoes of conversations that drained me. I started walking again, not for exercise, but for stillness. I rediscovered how quiet the city could be at dawn, how soft footsteps sound against an empty sidewalk, how deeply the sun breathes through bare windows when it isn't competing with tension. I began redecorating, nothing major, just removing the old, invisible traces of people who never contributed but always criticized. I replaced framed family photos with landscapes from places I wanted to visit. The refrigerator magnets that once bore smiling faces of relatives now displayed affirmations, you are not responsible for their happiness. Healing is not a group project. Being loved shouldn't hurt, and in those subtle acts of rearrangement, I felt the architecture of my identity shifting. One morning, I received a text from Ethan, just 5 words, how's your piece holding up? I stared at it longer than necessary before replying, solid. Like concrete after the storm. We met for dinner a few days later, no pressure, just warmth. He noticed the way I carried myself differently, shoulders straighter, eyes steadier. Midway through the meal, he leaned across the table and said, you don't flinch anymore when your phone lights up. He was right. I hadn't even realized it, but the reflexive fear, that every notification was another crisis I had to fix, was gone. In its place, space, time, freedom, and in that freedom, I started dreaming again, not escape dreams. Not fantasies. About running away. Real ones, ideas about expanding my consulting work, launching a mentorship program for women dealing with toxic family ties, writing a book, not a memoir, but something practical. A guide for survivors who needed more than sympathy. They needed a blueprint. Tools. Proof that you can break patterns and still build something beautiful. For the first time, I allowed myself to envision a future not built around avoiding pain, but creating joy. I even visited my college campus again. It had changed in ways I didn't expect. New buildings, different layouts. But one thing remained the same, the bench near the East Library where I had once sat, just after learning my loan co-signers had pulled out unexpectedly. I'd cried for an hour that day, thinking I'd never finish school. But I had. Without them. Without help. I had found a way. Sitting there again, years later, I whispered to the younger version of myself, "You were always enough." They just couldn't see it. I didn't need closure. I needed ownership of my story, of my worth, of a voice that had been silenced too many times by people who confused love with control. By April, the world was blooming again, soft greens, gentle winds, long golden hours. And I was blooming too. Not because the damage never happened, but because I had chosen not to let it define the rest of my life. When people ask me now if I talk to my family, I answer simply, no. I talk to the version of myself that believed them for too long. And I let her know she's safe now. Because she is. Finally, this isn't the kind of ending you see in movies. There's no dramatic confrontation in a crowded room. No sudden breakdown followed by tearful hugs and promises to do better. No magical shift that makes toxic people realize their cruelty. What I've learned is this: real resolution doesn't always come with apologies. Sometimes, it arrives in silence, through the realization that walking away was the most honest decision you could make. Not out of anger. Not from pride. But because staying would have required the continued betrayal of yourself. For years, I had been told that love looked like sacrifice. That forgiveness was unconditional. That family meant always giving one more chance, even when the last one nearly destroyed you. But that's not love. That's conditioning, and unlearning that belief. That was the hardest part. I used to believe that healing meant getting back to who I was before the damage. But now I understand, healing means becoming someone entirely new, someone wiser, stronger, gentler with herself. Someone who no longer tolerates harm dressed up as tradition. Someone who knows that peace isn't found by pleasing everyone, it's found by protecting your energy, even when no one claps for it. So if you're watching this, and you've ever been left out, written off, or blamed for breaking what you never damaged, hear me now. You're not the problem, you never were. You were simply the first one brave enough to say, this isn't love. And while that decision may cost you connections, it will return your clarity. There will be days when you miss the idea of family, but remember, missing what should have been is not the same as wanting what was. You owe yourself a life free from emotional taxation. You deserve relationships built on mutual respect. Not guilt transactions. You're allowed to say no without explaining. You're allowed to let go without feeling shame. You're allowed to rebuild everything, better, stronger, and entirely on your terms. As for me, I've stopped waiting for them to change. I've stopped hoping they'll wake up and realize what they did, because if they haven't by now, they likely never will, and that's okay. My story isn't about revenge. It's about returning to myself, returning to boundaries, returning to joy without fear. So no. I won't be attending the next birthday dinner. I won't be footing bills I never agreed to. I won't be showing up to play the role they cast me in decades ago. What I will be doing is this: living fully, loving selectively, and laughing without apology, because after everything, I'm still here, not bitter, not broken, but beautifully rebuilt, and that's the real ending point, one they'll never understand, but one I'll never stop celebrating.